Why, hello, my loves, and welcome back to Spook Manor. Your timing could not be better, for you see, a dear friend of mine has only just left, returning to his mystical adventures along the Southern Railway. A fine gentleman he is, too, for he has a compassionate soul with a fierce and fighting heart for justice. His harrowing acts in life were so great, he was even accepted into the Paranormal Beings Association after his human life came to an abrupt end. Known for being a Robin Hood of sorts, he shared with me yet another of his heroic adventures, this time saving the life of a young man in a desperate circumstance. It is through the eyes of this young man for which I shall share this fascinating retelling of events. Shall we begin? Kevin had always tried to be a good kid. Between a troubled home, living below the poverty line, and in a community of crime, it seemed he could never catch a break. At 16, he had suffered too many beatings by his alcoholic father, and with nothing more than a despondent, uncaring mother to keep him, he walked out the door one fall day and never looked back. He had heard stories from hopeful runaways that going south to the warm shores of Florida would be his best bet at a new life. He knew the harsh and heavy northern winters would be too much for him to bear on his own. Jumping trains was his key, and after many miles and weeks had passed, he found himself in survivable weather conditions nearing the Florida-Alabama line. Yet, warmer weather was only a factor in his being able to make it. Often he would stop in small towns along the way to steal food and clothing whenever possible. He almost never knew what town he was in or where his next stop would be. As the boxcar rocked one humid evening, Kevin awoke to the gentle sound of breathing. As he opened his eyes, he noticed a dirty and tattered black man sitting across from him in the boxcar. His clothing was drab and rotted, appearing as though they did not fit modern times. The man stared at him menacingly as they sat in silence, with only the moonlight to filter their shared existence. Kevin feared it was only a matter of time before the homeless man attacked him. His unblinking yellow eyes struck such fear that, for a long time, he couldn't move or speak. Minutes, which seemed like hours, had passed, and finally, Kevin broke the silence. "I ain't got nothing," he said in a stern voice. Still, the man did not move or speak. "I said I ain't got nothing," Kevin said again, a little louder, trying to keep the fear from his voice. Still, the unblinking man stared endlessly. In that moment of silence, Kevin suddenly became aware that the vagrant man was in far worse condition than he was, and a strange, warm feeling of rare compassion came over him. Surrender filled his voice as he spoke. "All I've got is this bread. Looks like you need it more than I do," he said, as he gently tossed his last morsel of food towards the man, trying not to look at him. "You can sleep. I won't bother you," he added, folding his arms over his chest and turning his head to the left to hide his nerves. It was then that the man stood up and began to limp over to him. A rush of fear and adrenaline surged as a strange gust of freezing wind swept through the boxcar. Kevin pressed his back hard against the cold metal wall behind him. The vagrant towered over him, cold eyes staring. It had become apparent that there was a long rifle in the man's bloody pant leg. What do you want?" Kevin hollered, which caused the man to stop in his tracks. The vagrant, stone-faced, then reached into his pocket and tossed out a small handful of coins. Then, to Kevin's surprise, he reached for the boxcar door, all the while staring at the young man with that same fierce, unblinking expression. How the tall, thin man had the strength to open the door with one hand and step off the edge of a moving car in one fluid motion, Kevin could not understand. In the blink of an eye, the vagrant was gone. Not knowing what to think, Kevin ran for the door and stuck his head out. The warm southern wind blew past him, and the moon shone bright. Yet, as Kevin stared toward the back of the train, the man could not be found. The only movement that could be seen was that of a large black dog, leaping away from the tracks and into the swampy woodland. Attempting to regain his composure, Kevin remembered the coins the strange man had left for him. Studying the coins carefully, he discovered they each dated between 1894 and 1896. It wasn't much, but hopefully he could trade them for a decent meal at the next stop. As the early morning approached, the train began to slow, and Kevin saw his chance to get out of the boxcar unnoticed. Walking briskly along the tracks in the opposite direction of the train's platform, he made his way to the outskirts of the small town. As he walked the marshy road, his mind pondered the man from the night before. He was lost in thought when suddenly he stumbled upon something in the tall grass. A fancy sign which read, Louisville and Nashville Railroad, established 1850. It was clearly very old and rusted, but in his mind, it must be worth something. Thankfully, it was small enough to fit in his backpack, at least until he could find a potential buyer, though after several hours of searching, he was unable to make a sale. Yet luck had fallen upon him regardless, as he was able to find a small mom-and-pop shop with enough compassion to trade food for his antique coins. With a full belly for the first time in ages, he began to make his way back to the train yard before nightfall. As he reached for an open boxcar door, he suddenly became aware of the sound of voices from behind one of the other boxcars. Fearing a local gang, Kevin quickly turned to go in the opposite direction. However, it was too late. A tall, dirty-looking man in his 30s stepped around the car in front of him. Then, two others appeared from the rear. It was clear they would have no trouble overpowering him, and began to berate him with foul language and sinister smiles. Pleading for them to leave him alone, this only prompted the inevitable. One man ripped open his backpack and began kicking through the contents on the gravel below, while the others began the assault. Kevin knew he was going to die that night, as blood blurred his vision, and he felt himself growing weaker under the fierce attack, the laughter of his assailants echoing loudly through the quiet train yard, when suddenly a gunshot rang through the air. In a puff of smoke, Kevin fell to the ground in the fetal position. The wind had been completely knocked out of him by a fist to the stomach. He knew the next shot would be for him. Yet the assault had suddenly stopped completely. Gasping for breath, he heard one of the men scream, "It's Railroad Bill! Run!" Kevin slowly pulled himself up, wiping the blood from his eyes. There was the black man again, staring at him from the boxcar doorway. He had an ancient, long rifle pointed in the direction of the three fleeing men. Thank you," Kevin gasped towards the man as he pulled himself to his knees, desperately trying to catch his breath. How can I ever thank..." His voice trailed off as the man began to fade into transparency. Then slowly, he vanished completely. Kevin scrambled to his feet in disbelief, running towards the boxcar. It was there that he found a trail of blood where the man had stood, leading far off toward the swampy marsh at the edge of the train yard. Following it, he suddenly stopped at the sight of a fox sitting at the end of the blood-lane trail. Its menacing yellow eyes stared at him unblinking, just as the man's had done, before it gracefully leapt off and disappeared into the night. Kevin stood in shock at the strange events he had witnessed. Suddenly, an authoritative voice called from behind him, "Hey, what are you doing down there?" He turned to see an older man in security uniform, pointing a large flashlight in his direction. At first unable to speak, Kevin fell to his knees again in pure desperation for some understanding. Then he began pouring his heart out to this stranger about the mysterious events that had transpired over the last 24 hours. The officer was kind and helped Kevin back to the train yard to gather his things. Calmly, he lowered his flashlight and, with a look of amusement, glanced down at the scattered contents of Kevin's backpack. Picking up the old Louisville and Nashville sign, he said, "You know, this was the name of the original railway here. Sounds like you met the ghost of Railroad Bill." Looking at the confused expression on Adam's face, he said, "He was a robber, a killer, a bandit, said to have had magical powers. Lawmen called him a villain, while others a hero, as he gave money freely to the poor, both blacks and whites alike, even when he hadn't much to give. It was said he could transform into animals, that he could only be killed by a silver bullet. That ain't true, though. After surviving several shootouts, he was finally killed in 1896 by one of the many posse that were after him. That's debatable, though, depending on who you talk to. Many don't believe he was really killed that day, and say he still travels this very railroad to this very day. You ain't the first to have seen him, and you certainly won't be the last." It was then that the security guard took pity on Kevin, who felt the experience was a sign to get his life straight. Giving the boy a hand up, Kevin now works as one of the caretakers at the local museum, where he proudly retells the story of Railroad Bill and how the old ghost had helped him get his life back on track. So tell me, my loves, have you met my dear friend Railroad Bill? Please comment down below and like and subscribe for more fictional stories that are often of actual urban legends and sometimes have historical reference. Have a good night.